So young people have been engaging in the UNFCCC since it began in the early 90s. Originally, they weren't recognised as one of the main non-state actors, like non-government constituencies. That didn't happen until provisional status in 2009 and confirmed in 2011. So originally they kind of held separate conferences and presented manifestos to the COP, a bit like the mock COP has done and the Conference of Youths will be doing. And it's a bit tricky to say how much these kind of documents shaped the negotiations, but those types of events do have a really big impact on building young people's capacity, creating a big network around the world for young people to share ideas and resources, and also like really creating momentum ahead of the events. So, for example, the last big climate conference, COP21 in Paris, all of the events and commitments from non-state actors ahead of that were described as this groundswell of activity that really created the right conditions for the Paris Agreement and made sure that awareness and expectations were really high. So governments kind of had to reach agreement to save face. In terms of young people's direct impact on policy in COPs, it's quite limited. So young people have formed working groups on a whole range of policies, from oceans to adaptation to climate finance, and shared knowledge and insights on all of these things. But because COPs are so huge with thousands of participants, a lot of whom are more powerful than young people and have more resources, just can get drowned out, and it can be hard to say what impact that has had. I've been to I think a dozen UNFCCC conferences now, including 6 COPs and then also intersessionals that are in between each year. And usually at the end of each conference, the youth constituency will have a meeting where they discuss their successes. And the key ones that have come out of that have been Action for Climate Empowerment, or ACE. So that is the original Article 6 of the original UNFCCC convention that calls for governments to work together on climate change education, training, public participation, access to information, public awareness, and international cooperation on those things. Quite often in those negotiations, there is a space for youth voices. It's something that the youth constituency have been really active in for many years. Before I was an academic, I used to work for a big international youth NGO, and I used to take delegates of young women from around the world to go and lobby for youth and women's rights at the COPs. And every year, negotiations on ACE were one of our main focuses. We had quite an unusual experience of COPs, I think, in that we were kind of like, oh yeah, we suggested this, and then it ended up in the text. And then you go to these meetings at the end of the negotiations, and everybody else was like, yeah, that did not happen to us. But it's literally because decision makers really associate education with schools and young people, so it's something that they really want to hear from young people on, and it's sort of much more likely to be able to have an impact on those negotiations and to work with, they're called ACE focal points, so it's like a nominated person from each country who will report on action for climate empowerment back to the UNFCCC and kind of oversee what that country is doing on it. So that's one area where young people have had an impact and continue to have an impact and are a really valued and recognised stakeholder. Unfortunately, that recognition doesn't often manage to break out of the silo of that particular policy. And the second one that young people have had an impact on is intergenerational equity. So the UNFCCC's youth constituency had a working group called INTEC, short for Intergenerational Equity, and they worked quite closely with an interconstituency group on human rights. So that had representatives from environmental NGOs, the Women and Gender constituency, trade unions, etc. They pushed really hard for different aspects of human rights, including intergenerational equity, to be included in the Paris Agreement. It was looking for quite a long time like that would be in the actual Paris Agreement, but at the last minute it got pushed to the preamble, which means it isn't legally binding, but it's sort of advisory to governments. But it highlights specific rights, human rights, right to health, right of Indigenous peoples, children. It mentions women, and then it says and intergenerational equity. So that was another area where the youth constituency had this really tangible policy ask that they could see in the text, which is pretty rare.